theoretical account of Christ's salvific activity. And so salvation was envisioned more as a matter of forgiveness of sin, right, as opposed to the patristic soteriology, which was about God making us divine, God sharing with us his divine nature and making us divine. So the attention and focus in medieval soteriology was on the cross and crucifixion, and the theology there developed in juridical categories. So we're thinking more of some sort of grand divine juridical system. Now, the main theological player, so to speak, in this field in the medieval times was Anselm of Canterbury. He was an 11th century bishop in Canterbury, England. And Anselm was a strong critic of the notion of ransom paid or offered to the devil. Right? So this ransom theory was this idea that somehow the devil had acquired control of humans and the earth, by deception, and the only way humans could get it back was if a ransom was paid to the devil. Okay, and so Jesus comes as a human being, and he's put to death. The devil sort of engineers this, the death of Christ, and in so doing, Jesus, as a human being, who is also God, pays this ransom, and then through his resurrection, they claim um, humanity and the earth for God. So that's in roughly the ransom idea. Now, Anselm was a strong critic of this. He just did not like this idea of a ransom paid or offered to the devil. So he wanted to show that Christian idea of the incarnation is compatible with God's dignity. You don't have to resort to explain to bringing up the devil to explain why the Son of God would become a human being. Okay, so he wrote a book called Cur Deus Homo, which is Why God Became Man, or literally Why the God Man. So his argument is divided into two parts, the two parts of this work. It's a very important book in theology. So first, he wants to demonstrate that without the incarnation, salvation of the human race would be impossible, right? So he's saying the incarnation is necessary for salvation. That means the Son of God has to become a human being if human beings are going to be forgiven of sin, for sin. Then, against this background, he argues that salvation is God's intention for the human race. Okay, so the incarnation, far from being inappropriate for God, is in fact a necessary element in fulfilling God's purpose in creation. So Anselm develops what is widely known as the theory of satisfaction, and this has influenced Western thought to the present day, theologically, philosophically, socially. Okay, it's a very important idea. So Anselm, his starting point is an assessment of sin and its effects. So instead of focusing on the content of specific sinful deeds, he views sin formally as an offense against God. So think of it this way. Um, if you stole from, let's go back to the 12th century, 10th, 11th century. Let's say you steal from a king, okay? Um, his Anselm is saying essentially it wouldn't matter if you stole one small gold coin or a million gold coins, right? The content of the sin is not the important thing. The fact is that you have sinned against the king. Okay, so in this context here with humans and God, is that human beings, when human beings sin, they sin against God, and the content of the sin is secondary. So Anselm drew on the legal theory of his day, right? So he basically adopted the paradigm of his time, and he measures guilt and the resulting debt in qualitative terms with reference to the dignity of the offended party. So in the case of sin, the offended party is God, and so the resulting debt is therefore infinite. Okay, so if you think about this again, it's not the particular sin itself, what someone did, but um, who was offended here, right? So God is offended, and so the way you measure the guilt is not by what was done, but by who was offended. And in this case, since God is infinite, therefore the the offense is infinite, and so to make up for that, it's going to be the resulting debt is going to be infinite. So two things then result. So you either need to be punished for sinning against God, or you need to make satisfaction. That's you need to make up for what you've done. One of those two things is necessary. Now, as long as the matter remains unresolved, the proper order of the universe is disrupted, right? Because God is not a private figure, but creator of heaven and earth. So, what does this mean? If there's no punishment or if there's no satisfaction, then that means the order of things is disrupted, right? Because it's what we're saying is originally God made things for everything to work together, right? And you give honor to whom honor is due, and that means you honor God in a particular way. Um, so since God is the author of the original order of things, it is incongruous to believe that God can accept anything less than what He ordained originally, right? Because what God made originally was what God intended, right? Which was a system of honor, of love, of justice, of mercy. And in sinning, humans have violated that whole order. Okay, so God cannot accept a system of things that is less than what He originally intended. So what Anselm is trying to do here, he's trying to do away with this idea that God could simply decide to ignore the punishment and just let the offense go. Now, one way of thinking about this would be to think of, let's say, classical composition, okay? So you think of an orchestra, and someone writes a piece for an orchestra. And so with an orchestra, you write out every single note for every instrument. And then everyone's supposed to play at the right tempo, the right notes at the right time, because this is what the composer wants. Now, if, for instance, the viola decides to, maybe the viola player decides to play her own notes, then that's going to go against what was originally ordained, what was composed. Okay, and that's going to violate the composition. And so that's the same thing here. Is that you can think of all of creation as a composition that is destined to work together to create a particular sort of harmony. Okay, so when we sin against God, Anselm is saying, well, you violated this God's composition, and you just simply can't let that go. You have to correct it in some way, either punish it or the person makes satisfaction. So now, like sin, payment of the appropriate satisfaction is also measured qualitatively. But here, the point of reference is the one who offers satisfaction in repayment of the debt. So what this means is that the human, so um, essentially, if you sin against God, then when you make satisfaction to God, that means when you try to repay God, because God is infinite, the repayment must be infinite, must match God. Okay? So what this means then is that the human race left on its own is unable to pay this debt it has contracted, right? Because human beings are finite. Um, and so any attempt at satisfaction would remain finite. We can never achieve this infinite payment to God. So you can see the dilemma human beings are in. And human beings are finite beings who have sinned against an infinite God. We've incurred this infinite debt of satisfaction, and just by virtue of our nature, we're unable to pay this debt. The other problem is that the human race has nothing that it does not already owe to God, right? So um, even if human beings could pay the debt, um, the things they would pay with essentially are already God's, right? So that's an additional problem. So if you look on purely human terms, the disrupted cosmic order cannot be restored. I mean, at this point where there's nothing that can be done, human beings, when they sin against God, just cannot do anything to make it right. Now, so if satisfaction can't be done, then perhaps punishment, right? But then for Anselm, punishment doesn't solve the problem because punishment of humanity would leave God's original plans for creation frustrated, and that's intolerable, right? Because God made human beings for a particular reason in the first place to be part of this beautiful composition. right? So if God has to punish human beings, it would have to be an infinite punishment, and therefore God's original plan would never come to fruition. Okay, so you can see punishment is just out of the question. This infinite punishment, anyway, right? And to forgive or ignore the debt is equally impossible, for divine mercy is inseparable from divine justice. Um, and in any case, ignoring the debt will leave the proper order disturbed. So at the same time, since human dignity and freedom must be respected, satisfaction must be offered by a member of the human race. Right? So a human being has to be able to offer this satisfaction to God, this infinite satisfaction to God. So the only way this can be done is that if you can have an infinite being become a finite being, and this infinite being then offer this infinite satisfaction. And so from this, Anselm concludes the necessity of the incarnation. So there was no other choice but the Son of God had to become human, right? The debt must be repaid, and the human being must repay it. Yet apart from the incarnation, no human being can do so. Therefore, given both God's initial free choice in creating the human race for a specific end and the fact of human sin, the incarnation of God's Son is needed to achieve the divine purpose. So that's why the Son of God, had to become human. Now, since death in Anselm's view is a consequence of sin, right, and Christ was sinless, he did not have to die. Okay. Nevertheless, as a true human being composed of body and soul, he was able to die if he truly chose to do so. Okay. Now, because of dignity of his person as true God, his death is of infinite value and constitutes a necessary satisfaction for sin. Okay, so you can see where the crucifixion becomes central here. Is that death was a consequence of sin. So Christ did not sin, so he did not have to die. Right now, but he was able to die because he was human, right? And so in dying, his death has infinite value, and that infinite value then can constitute necessary satisfaction for sin. Incarnation is the necessary presupposition of a necessary redemption. Okay, so this is Anselm's general theory of satisfaction. Okay, that Christ's death now offers satisfaction for us. So, in the centuries that followed, Anselm's theory achieved widespread acceptance in the West, though it's never been defined as a dogma of the Church. Okay, but it's still very much it's very much out there and is still there today. In the course of its reception, however, various modifications were introduced into Anselm's conception.